Africa's Colonial Debt and Reparations. How Africa Paid for Its Own Enslavement. Independence, a moment of triumph, celebration, and freedom. But for many African nations, independence came with a devastating price, a debt they were forced to pay to their former colonial masters. Today, we're uncovering the shocking history of how Africa was made to pay for its own freedom. Let's begin with a story not from Africa, but from the Caribbean, a story that set the stage for colonial reparations worldwide. In 1804, Haiti, the first Black republic, declared independence from France. But freedom had a cost. France demanded a staggering 150 million francs in compensation for their so-called losses, including enslaved people. Haiti paid this crippling debt for over a century. It's a story that echoes across the African continent. In Africa, colonial powers like France, Britain, and Belgium followed similar patterns. They didn't just leave. They made sure to extract a price, ensuring newly independent nations started their journey weighed down by debt and exploitation. Take Guinea, for example. In 1958, when the country voted for independence, France was furious. The French didn't just leave. They dismantled everything: schools, hospitals, roads, and even light bulbs. Guinea refused to pay colonial compensation, and France retaliated by leaving the country in ruins. This was independence, with strings attached. In Kenya, the story took a different twist. After a brutal fight for independence, the British agreed to redistribute land to Africans. But there was a catch. Kenya had to pay white settlers for the land. This money didn't come from Britain. It came from loans Kenya had to repay, trapping the country in economic dependency. Now let's talk about France. When its African colonies gained independence in the 1960s, France imposed what they called a colonial debt. This meant African nations had to repay France for the infrastructure and institutions built during colonization: roads, schools, and government buildings that were built to serve colonizers, not locals. Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other Francophone nations paid this debt for decades. And then there's Algeria. After a brutal war for independence, Algeria didn't pay direct compensation, but France secured favorable trade deals and continued to exploit Algeria's oil and gas reserves. Independence, in this case, came with a long-term economic price. Fast forward to 1980. Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia, gained independence from Britain. In addition to the colonial debt it inherited, as part of the Lancaster House Agreement, Zimbabwe was required to compensate white settlers for redistributed land. This compensation, expected to be funded partly by Britain, became a heavy financial burden that Zimbabwe carried for years and remains a point of tension to this day. Ghana, the first African country to gain independence in 1957, inherited over £200 million in debt from Britain. This amount represented loans and expenditures claimed by Britain for managing the colony. Ghana spent decades repaying this debt, diverting resources that could have been used to build its economy and improve the lives of its citizens. In 1960, when Nigeria gained its independence from Britain, it was burdened with £17 million in colonial debt, a staggering amount at the time. This debt was meant to cover infrastructure projects initiated during colonial rule, infrastructure designed to extract resources rather than benefit Nigerians. For a newly independent nation, this financial burden slowed progress from day one. In 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo declared independence from Belgium. But Belgium ensured its departure wasn't without financial benefit. The DRC inherited massive debts and was forced into exploitative agreements that gave Belgian companies continued control over Congo's vast resources, especially its rich mines. This economic strangulation contributed to decades of instability and poverty. In 1994, when South Africa finally ended apartheid and transitioned to democracy, the new government inherited massive debts from the apartheid regime. These debts were used to maintain the oppressive system, and their repayment continued to stifle economic growth for years after liberation. But why did this happen? Colonial powers framed these payments as compensation for their losses, ignoring the decades of exploitation, stolen resources, and forced labor. For them, freedom wasn't free. It was a business transaction. These financial burdens weren't just historical. they shaped the economic realities of today. Many African nations started their independence deeply in debt, with little to invest in education, healthcare, or infrastructure for their people. Imagine what could have been achieved without these burdens. In Nigeria, the £17 million could have funded thousands of schools. In Ghana, the £200 million could have revolutionized agriculture and industry. In the DRC, those resources could have been harnessed for the people instead of foreign companies. The stories of Guinea, Kenya, Algeria, Zimbabwe, and many others remind us of the lingering shadows of colonialism. The consequences of this financial stranglehold are still felt today. Despite these unjust beginnings, conscious Africans continue to fight for economic justice and a brighter future. The fight for independence didn't end with the lowering of colonial flags. It continues in the struggle to break free from the chains of economic exploitation. These stories remind us that history isn't just about the past. It's about the systems and injustices that still shape our world today. Help spread these untold truths by liking and sharing this video. Subscribe to uncover more stories about Africa's past and present.